I've been playing since Season 0 and have seen every champion release in the game. The release of Echo and the bitching storm that resulted isn't anything new, as players tend to cry about most champion releases. Echo is on the stronger side and annoying side for release, but this pales in comparison to some of the worst releases Riot has ever had. There have been plenty of releases that were simply horrible. The reasons were usually because of bugs and stupid numbers, but sometimes how they were handled was just simply borderline idiotic. This video isn't to insult Riot, since at the time some of these releases were when they were a budding company and they've kind of far improved since then with a few hiccups here and there. Again, Echo's release is nothing in comparison to some of these. I also have to mention that I am ignoring any releases that had unintended effects on the game, such as Nasus's release and Jax's release. Also, this isn't a list of the top X worst releases, but just a discussion about them. Some of these releases didn't feature an overpowered champion either, and instead just had detrimental results for the game. The release of Pantheon and Gragas marked a huge experiment for Riot. Prior to their release, Riot would actually allow you to play the new champion for free the day of release. This obviously caused problems because the players who bought the champion with real money wouldn't get the chance to play them, as they'd be taken away by somebody else. Or they would play the champion for free and end up not buying it because they became bored or they just didn't like it. It was never explicitly said that the release experiment was to see if people would pay for a new champion the day of release, but it seems to be the most plausible reason. Riot likely figured that they could release two champions at once and charge for one of them and make the other one free. They could see if players would buy the new champion and not make too much of a fuss over having to pay because the other champion is available for free. I figure enough people bought Pantheon to justify getting new champions behind a price tag because they switched to that exclusively right after. Still though, why does this make it one of the worst releases? It's because Gragas got royally shafted due to it. Gragas was insanely buggy and honestly felt incomplete, as if he was rushed out to test out this experiment. His ultimate would sometimes not work and sometimes would actually bounce people the wrong way. His body slam would simply do nothing sometimes, like literally nothing, and his hit detection for everything was awful all around. He had bad numbers too, but that could have been easily forgiven. This isn't the sole reason though. Riot was actually quite quick to fix Gragas. He actually became very playable the next patch, but Riot and the player base basically forgot about him. He became very unknown, even though he was by all means insanely overpowered at the time, considering how many times he had to be nerfed when he was finally discovered. Basically, the double champion release of Pantheon and Gragas resulted in Gragas being completely forgotten and ignored and seen as a bad champion, even though all his bugs were fixed right away. Release Xin Zhao. Even if you didn't play in Season 0, which was now technically Season 1, you'd have heard the horror stories of Release Xin Zhao. Despite the fact that he was never really the most overpowered champion in League, he causes nightmares for those who remembered him. At the time of his release, melee champions were simply awful. They decided that they had to compensate melee champions with more power in order to deal with all the kiting and CC. Xin Zhao's numbers were a goddamn train wreck. More range on everything, more damage, less cooldowns, higher stats. He was unstoppable. He was a threat at the very start of the game and simply mowed down people. Remember, this was also at the start of Season 1. Our very first taste of rank mode was marred by an insanely overpowered champion. Riot eventually dumpstered him and he disappeared for a while. There have been plenty of other releases that were awful, but I felt like highlighting Xin's release because this was the first time they intentionally released a champion like this. He wasn't buggy like Gragas, he didn't have unintended game-breaking interactions like Jax dodging towers, or any mistake like Ness's one-shotting ultimate. Riot totally intended Xin Zhao to come out, but he just happened to be insane. This was a bad release, but perhaps also a good one, as it taught them a few things. They did repeat this mistake a few times, but not as grossly as Xin Zhao. They did slip up with some champions like Zyra, but that's a whole nother story. Swain and Renekton share a similar situation. They both came out different than their champion spotlight intended. Swain wasn't weak by any means, just different, but Renekton was a total mess. The Swain situation was that his torment was different in the champion spotlight in comparison to what he had on actual release. You can watch Swain's champion spotlight to compare it on your own, but if my memory serves me correctly, the old torment dealt more damage based on how much you've already hurt the target, and the new one simply amplifies whatever damage you deal. Now, like I said, Swain wasn't bad, but he was a bit weak on release, though I blame this more on the fact that he was one of the harder ones to play at the time. People latched onto the changed torment and used it as a point to bitch so hard and threaten false advertising that Riot actually gave people refunds on the champion. Again, I think people just got upset that Swain wasn't face roll and wanted a refund. It was buyer's remorse and not some ethics crusade. Still, the bitching was very real and Riot had to cave in. The Renekton one was one that I feel was really stupid though. There is a quote I used to use a lot that went by, "Remember Renekton," because his spotlight made him seem much better than he actually was. Players had high hopes of him being a laner and a jungler and being awesome, but unfortunately, without telling the players, Riot had mega nerfed Renekton prior to him actually being released. The champion spotlight used footage of Renekton before he was nerfed. These releases tainted players' trust in champion spotlights for a while, for some people at least, and encouraged Riot to be a little bit more open with their player base. Skarner's release is one of the worst ever, specifically because of what followed after it. Skarner was released with horrible mana issues and a plethora of bugs. This isn't really anything new, but Riot's balancing response to him was honestly stupid. Basically, he didn't have the mana to actually clear the jungle, even though the spotlight showed that he could, and he was plagued with bugs everywhere. His ultimate wouldn't cast, and sometimes it wouldn't even hook someone when cast, yet it would still go on cooldown. His E would sometimes just fizzle, and his shield would run out faster than intended. The thing is, a few players liked taking him top lane, and they could make him work against weaker opponents. If they were able to farm up enough gold to buy some mana items, he would become a monster in teamfights. This was important because we realized that only mana issues and bugs were what were holding him back. Players told Riot to simply fix this and that Skarner would be good. Riot proceeds to buff Skarner's abilities but not his mana cost. Skarner continues to be just as bad. Riot does it again, and Skarner's still mana hungry. Riot then finally actually fixes his mana issues and makes his Q cost next to nothing, and Skarner becomes a powerhouse and dominates games left and right, because he's been overbuffed. After realizing their mistake, Riot proceeds to nerf his mana back along with his damage, his slow, his ultimate, and then nerf his shield too for good measure. They leave him like that, but at least the cost of his Q was slightly reduced, and changes to the game around him kept him from going back into the shitter. Riot will learn from this mistake and perhaps try to fix resource issues or bug issues before fully buffing a champion. This next one is mostly just because it clued us in that Riot sometimes would not actually agree with each other. Vladimir holds the title of being the one champion that Riot has openly stated should have never been released. They can't exactly remove a champion, and Riot likely didn't have the resources to overhaul a champion, especially one that was just released. It's too late now, in fact, to even try to do anything about it because Vladimir's kit has become iconic to the champion. There were plenty of other overpowered champions too, and some were arguably much more powerful. However, Vladimir was perhaps the truly most unfun champion anyone could have dealt with on release. He was nearly impossible to kill, and you could just ignore any harass you did, as he'd heal it back up quickly. Even more daunting is that his passive made him deal tons of damage and become unkillable much more quickly than anyone else at the time. Heimerdinger made the game boring, and Shaco made it scary and frustrating, but you could at least deal with them in some ways, and at least they were killable. Vladimir just laughed at the idea of dying. His release was so bad because a champion that sucks the fun out of the game was introduced in a hard way. He saw a lot of nerfs right after that. He's okay, now at least, but that was after a multitude of tweaks, and even so, he can still be frustrating to play against. He makes it on this video because he's the champion release that Riot regretted ever making. You honestly felt like Riot was apologizing to the player base every time they had to talk about Vladimir. As for honorable mentions, these champions all had bad releases too, but they were either tamer than the ones already mentioned, or very similar to them and does have the others win by default by being the first, or they don't have a neat story to tell like Gragas and Renekton. Zyra had the same problems in Zhao, but in mage form. Simply, she tore through entire teams and there wasn't really anything you could do against her in lane or in team fights. She was banned pretty much every single time until she was nerfed. Yorick came out so weak and so useless that no one could come up with any way of fixing him, and Riot was very stubborn about player feedback. They just ignored the suggestions to fix him, such as with mana buffs, until they finally caved in and gave him a slight rework. Rengar came out super buggy and wonky that he simply couldn't do anything right. Aside from a gimmicky AP build, he was flat out unusable in the way he was intended. Riot fixed it all and buffed him, and he became insanely overpowered. LeBlanc had really high damage that she could murder anyone in lane from the start. She was hotfix nerfed right off the bat. I think it only took about 1 day for that to happen. On the other hand, Lee Sin and Riven both received hotfix buffs after release. They just had so many horrible numbers and they couldn't do anything right. After that, they began to dominate and make people sad.